Having analyzed what the Bible, both Old and New Testaments, have to say about worship, we can now turn from studying biblical foundations to consider the historical foundations for Anglican worship. Here the big idea is simply that worship in the late antique and medieval churches in both West and East maintained continuity with Jewish and biblical precedent, even as new elaborations were introduced. In this lesson, we'll consider the worship of the Western Church from the mid-2nd century through the mid-16th century. We begin in the middle of the 2nd century in Rome, and here Justin Martyr's first apology gives a rough outline of a service. On Sundays, we read, the Christians gathered together to hear the memoirs of the prophets, that is, the Old Testament, followed by a sermon and a set of prayers. At this point, bread, wine, and water were brought forward, and after a series of prayers, the Eucharistized elements are given to all present. Those absent receive the elements from the deacons. Justin does not, however, give us the specific language used in these various prayers. But as we'll see, this basic outline of word and table continues as we move forward in time. In the 4th century, we begin to have more detailed liturgical records of what Christian worship actually looked like. With Christianity legalized after the conversion of Constantine, Christians were free to develop more elaborate liturgical services in honor of Christ the King. There is a surprising similarity across different parts of the Christian world and through the centuries of late antiquity and the Middle Ages, with the Eucharist being the center of Christian worship, around which structured liturgies continued to develop. To take just one early example, let's consider the Old Roman Rite, which in this form likely dates back to at least the 5th century. The order is as follows: Psalm 43, Confession and Absolution, an Introit Psalm, Kyries, Gloria in Excelsis, the Collect of the Day, the Epistle reading, a gradual psalm, the Gospel reading, the Sermon, the Nicene Creed, the Offertory, which would begin a long series of prayers in preparation for the Eucharist, which would include, after the Sursum Corda, the Sanctus, the Benedictus, the Pater Noster, and the Agnus Dei, before the actual distribution and partaking of the Eucharist. This basic form of the liturgy would be brought to England with the mission of Augustine of Canterbury in 597. And from there, it would evolve into a couple of different forms, the most famous being the Sarum Rite, or the use of Sarum. By the Sarum Rite, we mean the liturgy that developed in the Cathedral Church of Salisbury, England, in the 11th century, immediately after the Norman Conquest, although some claim it really dates more to the 13th century. It would come to be the dominant form of the liturgy in England, though it was also popular elsewhere in Great Britain and northwestern Europe. By one estimate, the Sarum Rite is about 90% identical with that Roman Rite that we just talked about, with only about 10% of it being adapted from other sources. Here, the order of the use of Sarum is quite similar to the Roman Rite, with the Nicene Creed being moved to before the sermon, at which time announcements were also given. Note especially the frequency and quality of sermons probably varied considerably from parish to parish. Now, over the course of the Middle Ages, the moment of consecration, rather than the actual act of communing, became the central focus of the Mass. The chancel of the church was separated by the nave by a rood screen, and based on the belief in transubstantiation, there grew up a whole host of practices of Eucharistic adoration, such as the elevation of the host, the feast and procession of Corpus Christi, which came to England in the 14th century, and the sponsorship of masses for the dead. Most lay people would have communed probably only about once a year at Easter, following having made a mandatory confession during Lent, and they would have only communed in one kind, the bread, followed by a sip of unconsecrated wine to be sure to wash it down. As the laity received the consecrated bread, a houseling cloth was held underneath their chins to catch any crumbs that might fall. Children were denied communion until they came of age, lest they drop or spill the elements. Now, however, in the late Anglo-Saxon and early Norman periods, paedo communion was the practice of the English Church. Many daily masses were celebrated by the priest alone, especially those masses said by so-called chantry priests, who said the Mass on behalf of the recently deceased or even a living patron who had endowed the services. The vast majority of the Mass, with the exception of the announcements and the occasional sermon, were of course in Latin, not English, hindering the ability of many to understand. Now, besides the Eucharistic Masses, clergy were responsible for performing 7 to 8 services a day, known as the divine offices. These services, known by their Latin names of matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, nons, vespers, and compline, were normally sung in plainsong. The basic liturgy of each office included psalms and canticles, antiphons, hymns, lessons or readings from the Bible, as well as other Christian writings, such as the Church Fathers or the Lives of the Saints, responsories, and prayers. Later in the Middle Ages, the Hours of the Virgin and prayers for the dead came to be added to these offices. Lay people were expected to attend matins and evensong on Sundays and on feast days, in addition to the day's Mass. Still, there was likely very little participation of the laity in the office, with the parish priest and clerk saying or singing the office in the chancel of the sanctuary in Latin, so it is unlikely these services were as popular as the Sunday Mass, which was after all required. Let's consider a bit more about what worship would have actually looked like in medieval England. The laity, again, were required to attend Mass on Sundays and on festival days, the latter number of which continued to expand to include ever more saints and local figures. During the Mass, clergy, and presumably by extension the gathered laity as well, participated in worship using their whole bodies. They would use various postures and gestures. Thus, they were to stand at the Gospel and in many of the prayers, to kneel at the elevation of the elements and when receiving the elements, to genuflect or to bow at each mention of the name of Jesus, to make the sign of the cross, to pray with their hands joined together, to knock the breast as a sign of penitence, and to kiss a small icon or tablet of Christ known as the Pax, as well as potentially any icons that were in the church. Indeed, medieval churches were full of statues, wall paintings, window glasses, and icons depicting the Trinity, Christ, or the saints. And of course, no one could have avoided smelling the incense that would have filled the churches. The liturgical calendar was the central way that the church marked time, that therefore people in the medieval church would have experienced time. Clergy wore fine vestments, including a chasuble, alb, amice, and stole, with different colors for different feasts or seasons. These colors matched the changing hangings on the altar. Over the course of the liturgical year, the church moved through the seasons of Advent, Christmas, Epiphany, Holy Week, Easter, Ascension, Pentecost, Trinity Sunday, and Corpus Christi, with additional Ember Days, Saints' Days, Patronal Feast Days, and Rogation Days throughout the year. Processions, such as on a Rogation Day or for the Feast of Corpus Christi, were important parts of the life of the parish. At the front of such processions, you would find boys carrying a cross, candles, thuribles, books, and reliquaries, and then the clergy, who sang or prayed as they processed around the church or the parish boundaries. New feasts dedicated to Christ, such as the name of Jesus or the Transfiguration, were introduced in the late Middle Ages. The medieval church stamped its imprint on the life of each individual by providing liturgies for all of the important moments of life, for baptism at birth, for confirmation, marriage, the churching of women after childbirth, and in sickness and in death. We can, especially in the medieval liturgy of the English Church, find so much of our present-day forms of worship. Indeed, much of the Eucharistic liturgy in particular is nearly identical with our own. We, too, move through a similar-looking liturgical year. Our prayer books encompass many of the same services for various major life events, from birth to death. But we've also glimpsed some things that are different. The belief in transubstantiation, and the correlating practices of Eucharistic adoration, the veneration of icons, and masses for the dead. Indeed, as we will see next time with the English Reformation, it will be precisely practices such as these which came under fire by the Reformers.